July 4th, 1776, a date that changed the course of history. The date that this nation's founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, creating the United States of America. The date we're now celebrating 250 years later.
Welcome to America 250, Pittsburgh's Path. I'm Ken Rice. All year, KDKA has been marking the lead up to America's 250th birthday with a weekly series that's not only told our nation's history, but also highlighted Pittsburgh's path in shaping the United States. Over this next hour, we're revisiting some of those stories as we celebrate the USA. And we begin where else but at the beginning, and a man named George Washington, a man who helped define this region before going on to become America's first president. Here's Chris DeRose.
His name was George Washington, and before becoming the general, president, and founding father we all know today, Washington was earning his stripes, testing his resolve, and learning from his defeats here in Western Pennsylvania. Andrew Masick, the president of the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, says Washington in his late teens and early 20s was an ambitious young man looking to distinguish himself.
By the time he was 16 years old, he had taught himself surveying, and he got jobs in the western wilds surveying, taking jobs that older men wouldn't take because they were too hard or too dangerous. And then by the time he was 21, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, came to him and said, I need someone to go out to the forks of the Ohio and confront the French and tell them that they're trespassing. And that's what got George Washington to Pittsburgh in the first place.
What would transpire between Washington and the French in the region over the course of the next several years would escalate into a global conflict between France and Britain. That conflict is known today by many as the French and Indian War, a war the French say Washington directly started when in May of 1754 he and his men killed the French commander Ensign Jumonville in an ambush near what is today Farmington, Pennsylvania in Fayette County. Less than 2 months later, and just a few miles away from the skirmish with Jumonville and his men, Washington would be defeated by the French at Fort Necessity, and while he was allowed to return with his soldiers to Virginia, he was made to sign a document basically stating that he was responsible for the death of the French leader. The following year, Washington found himself once again defeated at the Battle of the Monongahela, just 10 miles downriver from the French-held Fort Duquesne. Washington survived the battle, but many of his fellow British soldiers did not. General Edward Braddock was mortally wounded during the fighting, and the town that grew up at the site of the battle now bears the general's name, Braddock, Pennsylvania. Then in 1758, this time under the command of British General John Forbes, Colonel Washington once again found himself near Pittsburgh, here at Fort Ligonier. Matthew Galt, the director of education at Fort Ligonier, says that on November 12th of that year, while Colonel George Mercer was in a heated fight with French soldiers some 2 miles away from the fort, Washington rallied a force to help, only to find himself in the middle of another terrible situation.
So Washington, with his troops, are moving through the wilderness. It's dark, it's difficult to see, visibility very low. And suddenly, perhaps someone sees a shadowy figure dart from one tree to another. A shot rings out. The natural instinct is to fire back. And a hot fire ensues. We have a skirmish that's going on. Someone is going to realize that this is not the enemy. The enemy have removed themselves from the field. And what Washington suddenly realizes is the worst possible situation. Colonel Mercer and his men are who they are engaged with now.
The event would go down in history as the Friendly Fire Incident. Washington is said to have raced down the firing line, knocking muskets into the air when he realized what was happening. In all, some 40 militiamen were killed, wounded, or went missing, and Washington would later write that the incident was the most danger he was ever in during his military career. Until recently, the site of the Friendly Fire Incident was unknown, but several years ago, thanks to a group of dedicated historians and archaeologists, the location of the battle was found on private land in Ligonier Township. Though work at the site continues during the summer months, many of the artifacts that have been unearthed are now on permanent display at the Fort Ligonier Museum. Galt says that Washington's trials and tribulations in the region and his actions at things like the friendly fire incident are still being debated and studied, and that the decisions that Washington made, both good and bad, not only helped to shape him, but in turn eventually helped shape the United States as a nation.
So he makes wrong decisions. He makes right decisions. He was a human being. And by learning from those and acknowledging the good and bad, you start to find someone who we can relate with, who young people can relate with. Today, that they're able to see you can make a mistake and you can learn from it.
For KDKA-TV News, I'm Krista Rose.
We fast forward now to the 1800s and the years leading up to the Civil War, a painful part of American history. Josh Taylor shares a story that's been told before, but perhaps never quite like this.
Here in Indiana County, this museum tells so many stories of Western Pennsylvania's place in America's history, from slavery to the Underground Railroad to the Civil War and even Reconstruction. So many roads that tell these stories lead through Blairsville.
This is our 20th year, and I have been involved in the absolute inception. We were founded because I told a story to Lenwood Sloan, the Director of Cultural and Heritage Tourism in Pennsylvania.
Denise Jennings is the director of the Blairsville Underground Railroad History Center and also serves as board president. Through their research, the museum has identified 93 conductors of the Underground Railroad in Indiana County alone.
These were people who either opened their homes or actively guided from one place to the next. These were all the helpers. Noting, however, no one was ever going to come close to the risks that the freedom seekers themselves had taken, because these folks were the true heroes of the Underground Railroad.
But the tipping point was an incident that happened in 1845 when a young man who escaped slavery in Virginia was caught in Indiana, PA.
Someone ran for the abolitionists because they didn't want, death and murder and mayhem in Indiana. They said, well, I'm sorry, but this man is free to go. So the young men, rode him out on their shoulders, and he was released. Judge Thomas White was an Underground Railroad conductor who kept a station at his farm.
The museum also pays tribute to the nearly 50 black men from Indiana County who fought in the Civil War. 2 of those men who served were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
And Alexander Kelly was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for valor for his actions at Chaffin's Farm in Virginia. James H. Bronson. So this was the second.
Then there's the story of John Graff, a wealthy businessman in Blairsville who became a key conductor in Indiana County.
So John Graff had a tunnel from the riverbank through his brother's lawn and under our South Liberty Street into his carriage house. So we have created this to replicate the safe area. So this was a temporary spot, and Mrs. Graff, Lucy, would come out and she would lower food down to the freedom seekers. This is the actual bed that was used in the Graff safe area in Blairsville on the second floor of the carriage house. So freedom seekers slept in this very bed.
Jennings says this museum tells the story of the men and women who lived in this area, the horrors of slavery they escaped, and those who helped them find freedom. It also tells us why their stories matter.
But the one thing they all had in common, they were not free. They could not make their own choices. They could not move from point A to point B. And those freedoms, that which we enjoy every day, without a thought.
Reporting in Blairsville, Josh Taylor, KDKA-TV News.
Just a few years after the Civil War ended, a company was founded in Pittsburgh that's become an American classic, Heinz. Everybody knows Heinz ketchup, but there's so much more to the story of the H.J. Heinz Company. Once again, here's Krista Rose.
If you want to know about history in Pittsburgh and moreover the history of a great company like Heinz, the first place you should probably go is the Heinz History Center. And sure, this place is more than just a ketchup museum, but they do know a thing or two about their namesake. Emily Ruby, a senior curator at the Heinz History Center, says that the Heinz Company was started all the way back in 1869 by Henry John Heinz. But she says that while the company is famous for its ketchup, that wasn't the first big smash hit product they had.
It starts with horseradish. So at the time, it was a very popular condiment in the German community. And Heinz had this idea that if he could bottle horseradish, take that burden away from, at the time, it's housewives that are doing this work. He's like, I'll make a pure product, I'll put it in clear glass, and his idea takes off. His horseradish sells really well, and he starts to then add to the product line after that. And a few short years later, in 1872, he adds tomato ketchup to the line.
Now, contrary to popular belief, Heinz didn't invent ketchup, but many say he did perfect it. Made of sweet, juicy, red ripe tomatoes and offering a thick and rich signature taste, since its inception, Heinz has not only been the standard bearer for ketchup, but they remain the #1 selling ketchup brand in the entire world to this day. And Heinz not only perfected his ketchup, but he invented its famous 8-sided bottle, which can be seen in various sizes both inside and outside the History Center. But was the ketchup just one of 57 other things that Heinz made? Well, the answer to that question is yes, and also kind of no.
We're not 100% sure, but it seems that 57 just aesthetically was pleasing to him. He says he's kind of going through the numbers and he just stops at 57. He was a very religious man. 7 had like religious connotations. I think 5 was a number his wife liked. So 57 is what he settled on, and he went out that day and started producing 57 varieties. And then he would like list the 57 varieties, but there was always more. And he just loves this idea of having a number associated with his product.
And though the Heinz Corporation merged with Chicago-based Kraft Foods in 2015, and a large portion of their operation is now based in the Windy City, they still have a strong presence and legacy here in Pittsburgh.
I think there's a lot of pride in Pittsburgh, in the Heinz name. Heinz himself and then his descendants invested in the community. They created the foundation, the Sarah Heinz House. They named things. They redid, Heinz Hall, and so, they invested here. They lived here, and they cared about this community.
Reporting from Pittsburgh, the home of Heinz and their ketchup, Chris DeRose, KDKA-TV News.
Time for a break now, but buckle up. Lots more to come, including a trip down one of America's most iconic highways when America 250, Pittsburgh's path, continues.
Dr. Jonas Salk was a University of Pittsburgh physician and medical researcher whose groundbreaking work on the polio virus in the 1950s led to the development of a vaccine against the disease. During early trials, Salk was so confident in his work that he vaccinated both himself and his family, as well as his staff. Today, Dr. Salk's legacy lives on with the near eradication of polio, and his work is commemorated in a special public exhibit on Pitt's campus. We know it today as Route 40, but in the early 1800s, this national road was our first federal highway, stretching from western Maryland all the way into central Illinois, and in its heyday, tens of thousands of people utilized it. Today, historic sites like Seawright's Toll House along the national road in Fayette County help to keep the history of this pathway west alive.
The National Road isn't the only historic highway that winds through western Pennsylvania. The Lincoln Highway was America's first coast-to-coast road, still running right through the heart of our region. Chris DeRose shares why that road was, and still is, so special.
In the 5 years after the first Model T Ford rolled off the assembly line in Detroit in 1908, Americans became obsessed with the automobile. But while cars were becoming more common in cities and towns across the country, decent roads were not.
In the early years, if you owned an automobile, you could only really get around a little bit in the town because you couldn't drive to the next town.
That's Brian Butko, the director of publications at the Heinz History Center and the author of several books on the Lincoln Highway. He says before automobiles, if you wanted to travel long distances, you either had to take a train or you had to try your luck on dirt wagon roads that were never designed for cars. Thankfully, he says, there were visionaries like automotive pioneer Carl Fisher, who rallied the automotive industry and car clubs alike to create America's first coast-to-coast highway named in honor of President Abraham Lincoln.
The Lincoln Highway Association was incorporated on July 1st, 1913. And I'm sure that's not a coincidence because it would have been the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And there was a real push at that time to bring the country together. And what better way than a highway that would join east and west, people from the north and south could go on it.
The Lincoln Highway was completely privately funded, and it stretched for more than 3,000 miles from New York City to San Francisco. It crossed 12 states, and it ran right through the heart of Pennsylvania. Communities from Gettysburg to Greensburg and beyond experienced a tourism boom as motorists traveling east and west stopped along the way. Travelers spent money at quirky roadside attractions like Bedford's Coffee Pot gas station and the famous SS Grandview Point Ship Hotel perched high atop the Allegheny Mountains. The highway lasted roughly 15 years before eventually being numbered and absorbed into the federal highway system. And today, much of the old Lincoln Highway is known as U.S. Route 30. But historians say the roughly 200-mile stretch that cuts across Pennsylvania remains one of the best preserved Lincoln Highway corridors in the country. And if you want to experience that history for yourself, just outside Latrobe sits the Lincoln Highway Experience Museum, where visitors can learn about what still survives from the old road and what's been lost to time.
The Grandview Ship Hotel is not there anymore, right?
Correct. Yeah, it was destroyed in a fire in 2001.
Spencer Simpson, the manager of visitor services at the museum, is one of many people dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Lincoln Highway.
For a lot of people, it's like walking back in time. For our older visitors, they are recognizing things that they remember from their childhood. Our younger visitors, it's like something they can only see in a movie.
Simpson says part of the Lincoln Highway's charm is that even today, there's still something for everyone who's willing to leave the interstate behind and take the scenic route.
There's something about American life that is fairly consistent over the last century, where there's a touch point for everybody, and finding the point that everyone can relate to as an individual, and then expanding upon that, thinking, what might it be like for you if you were traveling the Lincoln Highway back in the 1920s or 30s, and what would you find interesting as you're driving along? It might not be the Ship Hotel or the giant coffee pot, but it might be the beautiful state parks and forests that we have in Pennsylvania, the scenic views. There's something here for everybody because life is very different than it was back then in some ways. In other ways, it's very much the same.
So whether you want to see the USA in your Chevrolet or simply explore Pennsylvania from a different perspective, consider taking a modern-day road trip into the past on the road that helped change America forever. Reporting along the old Lincoln Highway, Chris DeRose, KDKA-TV News.
Up next, from Connellsville to Berlin and Olympic gold, quite the run for a history-making athlete when America 250, Pittsburgh's Path, returns.
Nellie Bly was a famous American journalist in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Though she started her career in Pittsburgh, Bly shot to fame in New York City when she wrote 10 Days in a Madhouse, an expose on the deplorable conditions faced by patients at a mental asylum. Bly chronicled traveling the world and even was a correspondent during World War I. Today, an art installation in New York City commemorates her life and her work.
While Nellie Bly made history as one of the first female journalists in America, an athlete from Fayette County made history in Germany. The story of John Woodruff is both incredible and inspirational. Once again, here's Chris DeRose.
Author Neville Fay once wrote, "Trees have a tendency toward immortality." That may be especially true for this 90-year-old oak in Fayette County, a tree whose rings trace all the way back to the 5 rings of the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Germany, and a man named John Woodruff. Woodruff grew up in a poor family in Connellsville. His parents were only a generation removed from slavery. He didn't have much, but he had speed, discipline, and determination.
He excelled in the classroom. He became a standout on the track at Connellsville High School, and that talent earned him a scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh. Woodruff was just a freshman at Pitt when he made the 1936 U.S. Olympic track team. Woodruff was just one of 18 African-American athletes who traveled to Berlin that year to represent a country that in many ways still treated them as second-class citizens.
Just like with his University of Pittsburgh team, when you travel as an Olympic athlete, the black athletes cannot stay with the white athletes. They gather them together in New York. They don't stay in the same hotels as the white athletes. They're kind of sequestered and housed. There are 18 African Americans who compete for the U.S. in 1936. So they go on the boat together. They're a team together, but it really is these 18 athletes that provide kind of a bond and a community for each other and support each other throughout the games. And then they're going to Adolf Hitler's Germany.
The 1936 games were the first ever to be televised. Adolf Hitler intended them to be a global showcase for German superiority, a celebration of his so-called master race. But athletes like Jesse Owens and John Woodruff would dismantle that theory in front of 110,000 people inside Berlin's Olympic Stadium and millions more watching around the world. Woodruff's defining moment came on August 4th in the 800-meter race, a race he would win in unforgettable fashion.
The Canadian Edwards sets out, takes the lead, and Woodruff is hemmed in, and he can't, there's nowhere he can move. So he essentially stops dead, lets everyone pass him, moves to the outside lane, and then starts running again. And then he's got to maneuver again and win the race.
Woodruff surged across the finish line in 1 minute, 52.9 seconds. He won gold, having outrun and outmaneuvered the best in the world. The medal wasn't the only thing he carried home, however. Like every gold medalist in Berlin, Woodruff was presented with a small oak tree sapling from Germany's Black Forest, a living symbol of his victory. Today, his gold medal is preserved inside the University of Pittsburgh's Hillman Library, unchanged since 1936. But in Connellsville, that sapling took root. And over the last 90 years, it's grown into something far larger than anyone could have imagined.
This is one of the only surviving Olympic oaks from the 36 Olympics.
Right. As far as I know, there are only two.
That's George Von Banco, the co-founder of the Fayette County Sports Hall of Fame. He's among those working to make sure that John Woodruff's story and what he represented isn't forgotten.
What does this tree mean to this community?
It means a great deal. I've actually seen students gathered near the tree and hear the Woodruff story. And he would talk to them about life, about the way to get ahead, about his story, which in itself is a great story of overcoming things. And that's what that tree means to a lot of people. And the fact that it's still standing majestic in the corner is just unbelievable, isn't it?
John Woodruff passed away in 2007, but his tree still stands. Tall, rooted, and unshaken. A living reminder not just of one Olympic victory, but of a life spent serving others as a soldier, a teacher, a coach, and a mentor. A young man who once defied hatred on the world's biggest stage, then came home and quietly planted hope. And if it's true that trees have a tendency towards immortality, then this Olympic oak just might prove it. Reporting in Connellsville, Fayette County, Chris DeRose, KDKA-TV News.
John Woodruff's story is just one of the countless great sports stories to come out of Western PA. After the break, some major moments here in Pittsburgh that changed American sports forever. When America 250 Pittsburgh's Path continues.
Before the Pittsburgh Pirates won the World Series in 1971, they made history when on September 1st of that year, they fielded the first ever all-minority starting lineup. 9 men, including Clemente, Stargell, and Ellis, were all in this incredible group, and the milestone of having an all-minority lineup in the MLB has never happened before or since. The Pirates, by the way, won the game against the Phillies that day, 10-7.
Welcome back to America 250, Pittsburgh's Path, KDK's celebration of America's 250th birthday and big events in the Pittsburgh area that shaped our country. That 1971 Pirates lineup is just one of many historic moments for the team. So let's travel back in time a little further for another one. Chris Hoffman shows us how Pittsburgh stepped up to the plate and helped create baseball's first World Series.
On the North Shore, within a couple hundred yards of each other, you have Lewis and Clark's adventure. You have Clemente's 3,000th hit, Franco's immaculate reception, as well as the first World Series, which was then Allegheny City and Exposition Park for the Pirates. 125 years later, we're still playing the Fall Classic. It all started right here.
The Dodgers stand tall and win back-to-back titles.
While the World Series has become a staple every October and sometimes into November, it's hard to imagine a time where it didn't happen. At the turn of the 20th century, you had the National League and the American League, and they didn't play each other at all.
So there's all this fighting going on. There's players being stolen, contracts being broken, fields up in the air.
The Pirates had won the NL pennant in 1901, 02, and again in 03. The Boston Americans, now the Red Sox, won the AL in 1903. So Pirates owner Barney Dreyfuss and Boston's owner decided to have a series between the two leagues. The idea was to bring them together and make some more money.
So while there had been World Championships before this, this is really considered the first official World Series.
Our first owner, Barney Dreyfuss, is actually considered the father of the World Series.
It was determined to be a best-of-9 series, unlike the best-of-7 we have now.
Actually, Barney Dreyfuss suggested first, let's play a best-of-11 series.
Back then, I think it was just two teams getting together to play to decide who was the best team in baseball.
The first 3 games would be at Huntington Avenue grounds in Boston, 4 games then at Exposition Park in Allegheny City, which is now what we know as the North Shore, and then the last 2 games would be back in Boston.
This is something that really creates excitement, creates fan involvement, creates attention for the sport. So it's very important to really launching Major League Baseball as we know it today.
Remember, it's 1903, so there's no internet or TV, not even radios around. You either read about it in the newspaper or went to the ball game. And both ballparks ended up with beyond capacity crowds. Fans were actually standing in the outfield grass, separated by as little as a rope from the field of play.
On the field, actual field, and it blows your mind.
They actually had a great rule. If the ball rolled under the rope, it's a ground rule triple. There are actually 17 ground rule triples in the 4 games that they played in Exposition Park.
This series featured all-time greats like Hall of Famers Honus Wagner, Fred Clark, and Cy Young.
So you have this battle between not just 2 great teams, but a number of players who go on to define the best in baseball.
Unfortunately, the Pirates would lose the series 5-3. They wouldn't get their first World Series until 1909, but the game laid the framework for what brings in millions of viewers each fall.
It was more a spectacle and like, okay, we'll see how this plays out. And sure enough, it played out really well.
Not only is Pittsburgh the city of champions, it's also where championship series have started. Chris Hoffman, KDKA-TV News.
From baseball to football now. In April, Pittsburgh was on the world stage as we hosted the 2026 NFL Draft, but that actually wasn't the first time the city hosted it. Josh Taylor, Chris DeRose, and Cassidy Wood team up to look at the origins of the NFL Draft and pro football's deep roots right here.
If you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers today, you see one of the league's most successful franchises backed by a passionate fan base. But when the team first entered the league, things looked very different.
The Steelers of the 1930s were struggling on the field and financially. They had trouble attracting top talent, building a fan base, and staying competitive. And they weren't alone. Across the state, the Philadelphia Eagles were facing many of the same challenges. So in 1935, Steelers owner Art Rooney and Eagles owner Bert Bell came up with an idea, one that would change football forever. A system where the league's worst teams would get the first chance to select the best incoming players in the draft. And just over a decade later, Pittsburgh would play host almost by accident.
December of 1947, the 1948 draft is supposed to be held in Chicago. And yet, amazingly, the Steelers and the Eagles have tied, and they need to play a postseason game to determine the Eastern Division Championship. Their very first playoff game, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and that game is going to be in Pittsburgh at Forbes Field on December 21st. The draft is Friday, December 19th. They move it from Chicago to Pittsburgh because the owners need to be here for that playoff game.
But hosting the draft is just one chapter in this region's rich professional football history. For more on this, I'm tossing it to Chris DeRose in Latrobe. Hey, Chris, go long.
Thanks, Josh. You know, Western Pennsylvania's connection to pro football runs deeper than the Steelers and the draft. In fact, decades earlier, the first all-pro team was formed right here in Latrobe. In the late 1890s, football was growing rapidly across the country, with amateur teams forming at colleges, clubs, and community organizations. But in Latrobe, something different was happening. The Latrobe Athletic Association, which was connected to the local YMCA, became the first group to openly transition from amateur play to professional football. In 1897, they built a roster, paid players, and they helped turn the game into a business.
There were other teams that had played in 1896 with all paid players, but only for a game or two. And there was another team that paid theirs, but it was kind of a combination. So Latrobe had the first all-professional football team.
Now, John Browyer, who was the quarterback of that team, was thought for a long time to be the first ever paid professional player, but it turns out that's not exactly the case. For more on this story, I'm going to toss it back to Pittsburgh and my colleague, Cassidy Wood.
Thanks, Chris. The first professional football team may have been created in Latrobe, but as for the first paid professional player, well, that happened right here in Pittsburgh.
His name was William Pudge Heffelfinger, one of the biggest stars in early football. A three-time All-American at Yale, Pudge was highly sought after. In 1892, two Pittsburgh teams, the Pittsburgh Athletic Association and the Allegheny Athletic Association, were battling for bragging rights and had a big game coming up against one another. Both wanted Pudge, but Allegheny made it official, offering him $500 to play. He accepted and delivered. Pudge scored the game's only touchdown and secured the win for the club. For decades, that payment wasn't widely known until a discovery changed everything.
This ledger book turns up for the Allegheny Athletic Association at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and there is recorded, William Pudge Heffelfinger, $500. So that became kind of the Bible about the founding of professional football.
And if you're wondering, $500 in 1892 would be equivalent to $18,000 today. Not bad for one game. Reporting in Pittsburgh, I'm Cassidy Wood.
At the Heinz History Center, I'm Josh Taylor.
From Latrobe, I'm Chris DeRose.
KDKA-TV News.
From stadium seats to theater seats, coming up how Pittsburgh revolutionized cinema worldwide. America 250, Pittsburgh's Path. We'll be right back.
The Ferris wheel was invented by Pittsburgh engineer George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. to be the main attraction at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. For the 19 weeks it was open, the Ferris wheel made over 10,000 revolutions, carrying an estimated 1.5 million passengers and making the name of Ferris legendary. Sadly, Ferris died just a few years later, but his wheel keeps delighting people and keeps on spinning in variations around the world to this day.
The Ferris wheel is one of many iconic inventions with ties to Pittsburgh. Do you know the first movie theater in the world was right here? We'll grab some popcorn and dim the lights as Chris DeRose tells us about the Nickelodeon and the impact it still has on the film industry.
If you find yourself in a movie theater today, getting ready to watch the latest big-budget action blockbuster or even the small art house rom-com, you might be surprised to know that the movie-going experience that's shared by millions around the world all started on Smithfield Street in Pittsburgh back in 1905 at a place called the Nickelodeon. Of course, we know that name today to be associated with a kids' television network, but back in the early 1900s, the word Nickelodeon had a different meaning.
It comes from a combination of words, the idea of a nickel, that is 5-cent entertainment. An Odeon was really, technically, it comes from the Greek word for a roofed building or a structure. And it really had come to also mean a theater or a space where you have different kinds of amusements. And Nickelodeon, the word, it actually came into use in the late 1800s, and it tended to mean small entertainment or things that were a nickel.
The theater was started by Harry Davis and John P. Harris, and the idea was to have a permanent place to show motion pictures, which by 1905 had graduated from things like people just walking on the street to silent pictures that lasted for several minutes and had a plot line that told a story. The location on Smithfield Street was perfect to lure in the foot traffic of the working class people of the city, and it allowed folks to sit or stand, watch the feature, and then go on their way. What was the first movie shown at Pittsburgh's Nickelodeon? Well, nobody really knows for sure, but chances are good it was something like The Great Train Robbery of 1903. The Great Train Robbery was a silent 15-minute Western that featured, well, you guessed it, a train robbery. And how many people came to see movies like this each day from 8 a.m. to midnight at the Nickelodeon? Roughly 7,000 people stopped in every single day. It's no wonder that these theaters started popping up all over town, all over the country, and even all over the world. For about 10 years, the Nickelodeon was on top, but just like with any good movie that was shown there, eventually it had to come to an end. What inevitably closes this theater? I know they popped up everywhere, but what kind of leads to the decline in this?
Over time, especially as the movie industry changed, as films became more elaborate, as they became longer, they really needed a different kind of structure. And as it became more of an industry with bigger budgets, fancier expectations, the Nickelodeons just were never meant to compete. And so they died out as more fancy movie theaters came onto the scene.
Today, there's no trace of the old theater on Smithfield Street, but the memory of this Nickelodeon lives on. Not only can one learn about Pittsburgh's cinematic past through an exhibit at the Heinz History Center, where you can actually see the first projector ever used at the Smithfield Nickelodeon, but on Liberty Avenue, you can see both foreign and domestic films daily at the Harris Theater, named after John P. Harris, the co-founder of the world's first permanent cinema. But maybe the best way to sum up the legacy of the Nickelodeon and its impact from the turn of the last century is to talk about Pittsburgh's role in motion pictures today.
Southwestern Pennsylvania is in the top 10 places where people want to film their movies.
That's Dawn Keyser, the executive director of the Pittsburgh Film Office, who says that the film industry in the region today not only employs thousands of people, but it generates more than $150 million into the local economy each year. Keyser says there's a lot of pride in Pittsburgh's cinematic past, present, and future. Knowing that the first permanent movie theater in the world was just down the street from where the current Pittsburgh Film Office is today, what does that mean to you?
I think it's important. I think it shows you the evolution of where we were, where we are today, and what's really important is where we're going, right? With the advent of AI and all these new technologies, Pittsburgh's really uniquely situated to take advantage of all that. But the Nickelodeon, right down the street here on Smithfield, first movie theater, you could pay a nickel and escape all your troubles and go watch the movies. So it only stands to reason we should be making movies here today.
Reporting in Pittsburgh, the Hollywood before Hollywood existed, Chris DeRose, KDKA-TV News.
Up next, while Andrew Carnegie is known as the Man of Steel, we're going to explore his softer side when America 250, Pittsburgh's Path, returns.
The Freedom House Ambulance Service formed in 1967 to help provide emergency services to minority neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, and it became the first community-based emergency management service with trained medics, many of whom were African Americans. Today, in every ambulance across the country, their legacy lives on because it was Freedom House's training program that became the model for all EMT training in the nation.
The Freedom House Ambulance Service changed the world of emergency care, not unlike the way Andrew Carnegie changed the world of steelmaking. But we're not here to talk about Carnegie's industrial strength. Christine Sorensen shows us how Andrew Carnegie also put Pittsburgh on the map with art.
Many people think of art as paintings hanging on a wall or classical sculptures, but the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh shows us art comes in many forms: neon signs, video projections, dried plants twisted and dyed, and live plants too. These pieces of art are all part of the Carnegie International, either in the past or in the current exhibition on display until January.
The art world turns its gaze to Pittsburgh every 4 years. We do it every 4 years.
In 1895, Andrew Carnegie founded the Carnegie Institute, which became the Carnegie Museum of Art.
And that happens right here in Pittsburgh.
Museum director Eric Crosby explains, while other museums were filled with masters of the past, Andrew Carnegie wanted the museum to show the art of its time, or contemporary art.
There aren't any other museums in America that were established in the 19th century dedicated to the art of its time. So he was quite a visionary in that.
It all started with the Carnegie International Exhibition.
We've been continuing that tradition for 130 years. And that's a show that brings art and artists from around the world. And then we, as a museum, collect out of that exhibition. And we're actually standing in a gallery full of artworks that were collected from past Carnegie Internationals.
Through the Carnegie International, the museum has acquired artworks by important artists, including Winslow Homer's The Wreck from 1896, Mary Cassatt's Young Women Picking Fruit in 1899, Willem de Kooning's Woman 6 in 1953, and Richard Serra's sculpture titled Carnegie in 1985.
So what was current in 1896 when the museum opened is not what's current today, but we've been able to track the developments of contemporary art over time and to collect from the Carnegie International to reflect that important history.
The Carnegie International also helped some artists gain recognition, like Pittsburgh artist Thaddeus Mosley, who got international acclaim at 92 years old when he was included in the Carnegie International in 2018. Andrew Carnegie created the museum to be part of a larger cultural center in Oakland, including the Natural History Museum, Music Hall, and Library, which are all connected.
When you step across the threshold into the Carnegie Institute, you are really entering an entire museum world with opportunities to discover art, to learn about nature, to hear music, to see performance, to experience architecture, to experience the history of Pittsburgh. And it's all right here.
So while much of the world still thinks of steel when they think of Pittsburgh, the art world looks here for the longest-running contemporary art exhibition in North America, a gift from Andrew Carnegie that keeps on giving. He
wanted Pittsburgh to be known for arts and culture as much as he wanted it to be known for steel and industry. And that's a commitment that we carry on today.
Christine Sorensen, KDKA-TV News.
He's America's favorite neighbor. I think you know who I'm talking about. Up next, how Fred Rogers built a legacy here in Pittsburgh that's become larger than life. When America 250, Pittsburgh's path continues.
Pittsburgh has seen many firsts, but one of the biggest was the first commercially licensed radio broadcast in the world back in 1920.
This is KDKA of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
What started as the broadcasting of election returns grew into a radio broadcasting boom across the nation and across the world that's still going strong to this day.
A few years before he introduced America to his neighborhood, Fred Rogers spent some time here at KDKA. He worked with Josie Carey, a popular local children's show host in the early days of Pittsburgh TV. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and the land of make-believe changed the face of children's programming and educated so many kids over the years. Krista Rose shows us how Fred Rogers' legacy lives on.
If you ever walk around the city of Latrobe, almost everywhere you can see nods to Fred Rogers, everyone's favorite neighbor, TV show host, author, composer, and native son. You can even stop by Rogers Park downtown and get a picture with the man himself.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor.
Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood ran for 31 seasons on PBS and was the brainchild of its host, who used the program to teach, learn, play, and pretend with children. And though Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood ended in 2001 and Fred Rogers passed away in 2003, his memory and the memory of his life's work still live on to this day. Why are people still enamored with Fred Rogers all these years later?
I think it's because Fred Rogers was a person that we could trust.
That's Emma Swift Lee, the director of the Fred Rogers Institute at St. Vincent College, an institute that's main mission is the strengthening of families and caring adults to support the healthy development of children.
He deeply cared about children. He deeply cared about us. And I think that's the kind of relationship that doesn't fade.
The Institute is home to not only a public gallery, but a massive private archive of Mr. Rogers' work that contains thousands of his writings, his scripts, his correspondence with fans, and even recognizable pieces from the show.
That's the famous pool? Mr. Rogers and
Officer Clemens.
That's a little bit of history because that whole picture is such a big deal.
It's a really big moment. The way Fred Rogers was really careful to show children the values that he had about belonging and how everyone was welcome in his neighborhood.
But the Institute and Rogers' hometown are the only places keeping his memory alive. In the city where he shot his show, there's another Fred Rogers statue to visit on Pittsburgh's North Shore. And just a figurative trolley stop away at the Heinz History Center, you can immerse yourself in the neighborhood and see the famous sets and props from the renowned show.
That's a speedy delivery bike, and well, I had two.
Actor David Newell, who played the speedy delivery man Mr. McFeely on the show, remembers his time in the neighborhood with fondness.
So when I had to ride the speedy delivery bike, the two-wheeler, the first I delivered, I could push it up to X the L's tree, delivered something. I said goodbye, and I drove around the tree and ran right into the limb. So Fred said, let's get you a tricycle. And there it is.
Newell says that Rogers cast him in 1967, but little did he know then just how big the show would be.
Speedy delivery!
And that almost 60 years later, he'd still be meeting fans and keeping both the show's legacy and the legacy of Fred Rogers alive.
He was one of the most intelligent persons I have ever met. Very, very smart. And he could speak French, he could speak several languages, and he loved learning. And I think that came out in the program. His love of learning, he was giving it to his viewers.
And while reruns of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood can still be viewed on PBS, Fred Rogers Productions has continued to carry on the legacy of its namesake and his mission to produce educational and entertaining television for children.
Speedy delivery! Royally good timing.
Among the many shows Fred Rogers Productions has created, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood continues the stories of many of Mr. Rogers' characters through the adventures of their children, which CEO of Fred Rogers Productions, Paul Siedkin, says leads to multiple generational viewing between parents and kids.
What is the legacy of Fred Rogers, of Mr. Rogers?
His legacy exists beyond our work. Those messages of kindness and respect, and primarily the idea of neighbors. To think about yourself as being the only person in the world exactly like you, and what is it that you can bring to your world that can make it a better place.
Reporting from the neighborhood, Chris DeRose, KDKA-TV News.
Perhaps no better way to end than with a person, a neighbor we all might aspire to be as we celebrate the United States, our heritage, and what makes this nation special. Our thanks to Chris DeRose for being the driving force behind our America 250 series, and to everyone else who had a hand in it. I'm Ken Rice, and for all of us here at KDKA, thanks for watching, and happy 250th, America.